In the dim silence between memory and myth, there are moments when a soldier realizes that the war he thought he understood is far larger, far heavier, and far more inevitable than anything he could have imagined. And in those moments, when the horizon glows with the fire of distant factories he has never seen, when he hears the thunder of machines built by hands he will never know, he understands that the world he is fighting for is already slipping away, and that surrender no longer feels like defeat, but the final breath of a truth too big to resist, a whisper that says, "This is the power you were never meant to face." And with that haunting truth pressing against the ribs of the war itself, the story begins, drifting like smoke across the scarred fields in 1944 Europe, where the German war machine, once a symbol of unstoppable force, now trembled beneath the weight of an enemy whose true strength was not in its guns, nor its tanks, nor even the millions of soldiers crossing the Atlantic, but in the endless, unstoppable heartbeat of American factories that roared louder than the front lines themselves, forging steel, hope, and relentless momentum with a speed that defied everything the high command believed about war and the limits of human industry. And as the German officers stared at captured reports, intercepted photographs, and whispered testimonies from spies who had walked through Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago, they felt a coldness seep into their bones, a quiet, heavy dread that no battlefield victory could erase. Because what they saw was not simply production. It was creation on a scale that dwarfed nations and rewrote the destiny of continents. And the Luftwaffe officers who once boasted of precision now spoke in hollow voices, as they traced the lines of American assembly plants stretching like veins across a giant, each one pulsing with life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, illuminated by floodlights that turned night into a pale imitation of day, where men and women worked in shifts so constant that machines never cooled, steel never rested, and the air vibrated with an industrial fury that seemed impossible for a nation that had not even been at war 2 years earlier. Yet here it was, an arsenal not of soldiers but creation itself, a river of material so vast that generals struggled to calculate it, factories producing aircraft faster than Germany could shoot them down, tanks faster than they could destroy them, ammunition faster than they could fire it, and ships faster than U-boats could sink them, and somewhere deep inside the Reich, chancellery and the command bunkers beneath Berlin, quiet arguments turned into murmurs of disbelief, because the numbers did not make sense. The scale felt unreal, and yet every front reported the same thing. American material, American vehicles, American artillery, pouring into fight like an unbroken tide, and even hardened officers, men who had marched across Poland, France, the Balkans, men who had survived the Eastern Front, felt a strange, suffocating pressure in their chests as they whispered to one another, "How can a country build so much, so fast?" And the truth was that they were not simply fighting an army. They were fighting the weight of an entire continent, a nation whose geography shielded it, whose population fueled it, and whose factories had become something close to myth. And those myths reached German ears in fragments carried by spies who had slipped through shadows, men whose reports were read under dim lamps by officers who wanted to dismiss them as exaggeration, as American propaganda, yet could not, because the evidence was too overwhelming. Factories so vast that trains ran through them, assembly lines so long that workers used bicycles to reach the far end, aircraft plants where wings, engines, and fuselages flowed together like streams merging into a river, steel mills whose glow lit the night sky for miles, and the harrowing realization that America could outbuild not just Germany, but Germany and its allies combined. And when captured German prisoners were transported through American ports on their way to POW camps, many of them stared to the rails of the train in stunned silence as they passed row after row of factories larger than anything they had seen in Europe, buildings with thousands of windows, chimneys roaring, conveyor belts whirring, and entire neighborhoods of workers streaming in and out like tides of humanity. And some of those soldiers later said at this moment, not defeat on the battlefield, not bombings, not the collapse of the Eastern Front, was when they understood the war was lost. Because how do you fight a nation that can build a new army faster than you can destroy the old one? And how do you defeat a people who seem to create war material with the same ease that others breathe? And so the story of Germany's shock was not just a story of numbers or steel or logistics, but of human realization. The slow dawning horror inside officers who once mocked American industry as soft, unfocused, too consumer-driven, who now sat in bunkers and stared at reports that felt like judgment, And among them was a man named Oberst Reinhard Mertens, a logistics officer whose job had once been routine, but who now found himself awake at 3 in the morning more nights than not, hands clasped pulse tight, as he read the newest intelligence summaries delivered by trembling couriers, each page painting a portrait of American industry that made his stomach twist, because in those lines he saw a truth he could not deny. Germany had started a war of iron with a nation made of factories, and as he walked through Berlin, past shattered buildings and ration lines, he could feel a weight settling on his shoulders, the realization that they were sending young men to fight a war the nation could no longer sustain. And he thought of his son on the Eastern Front, and of the thousands of boys barely 18 now being drafted, and he wondered if their sacrifices meant anything against a country that could replace every destroyed tank with 3 new ones. Every lost aircraft with 5. And he remembered the day he saw the first intercepted photographs of the Willow Run bomber plant, a building so massive that it felt like something from a fever dream, a place where 24 liberators rolled off the assembly line so constantly that American officers joked they were built like sausages, one every hour, and Mertens had stared at that photograph for a long time, the scale almost incomprehensible, realizing that the Luftwaffe pilots risking their lives each day were flying into a sky America could refill endlessly, and when he briefed the superiors, he saw the same quiet shock in their eyes. Officers who had once believed in the certainty of German engineering now silently wrestling with the reality that engineering meant nothing if you could not build fast enough, and somewhere deep inside him, a fracture formed. Not disloyalty, not rebellion, but quiet, aching grief, the sense that he was watching the slow death of the nation he loved, not because its soldiers were weak, nor its spirit broken, but because it had underestimated the one thing that decides wars more than courage or strategy, the power to rebuild what is destroyed faster than your enemy can destroy it. And as 1944 turned toward 1945, and the Allied offensives tightened around the shrinking borders of the Reich, Mertens felt that fracture grow, a pressure behind his sternum, a whisper in his mind that said the war was already over, even if the guns had not yet gone silent. And yet he kept working, kept calculating, kept delivering reports no one wanted to read, because duty did not disappear simply because hope had. And in the bomb-scarred streets of Berlin, where elderly men carried rifles and children dug trenches, he saw the final tragic truth. Germany was still fighting, but the war had already chosen its victor, and that victor was not on the battlefield, but in the factories across the sea, factories that never slept, never paused, never faltered, factories that beat like the heart of a giant awakening to its full strength. And as he prepared one last report for the high command, a report they would, read in silence, he felt something break inside him, the painful understanding that surrender was not cowardice nor betrayal, but the final recognition of reality, the last act of nation standing before a storm it could not withstand. And though he did not say aloud, he knew the war was lost not in the rubble of Berlin, not in the snows of Russia, but in the endless glow of American factory lights that burned through the night like the eyes of a future Germany could not escape. Under the flickering yellow glow of a dying Berlin street lamp, Oberst Reinhard Mertens stepped out of the bunker and inhaled the cold night air, a thin veil of smoke drifting from distant fires that had become as familiar as the city's own breath. And as he stood there, coat wrapped tight against the November chill, he felt the quiet tremor of artillery in the distance, each dull thud rippling through the soles of his boots like a heartbeat slowing toward an inevitable stop. And in that trembling darkness, he wondered how many men across the front lines were feeling the same thing, that strange sense of waiting, not for orders, not for victory, but for the moment when the truth could no longer be ignored, when even the most loyal believer would look at the ruins around him and realize that the country had been outbuilt, outpaced, and outnumbered before it ever truly understood the scale of the enemy it had awakened. And as he walked toward his quarters, passing shattered storefronts, boarded windows, and walls painted with fading propaganda slogans, he felt the weight of the war settle more heavily around him, pressing into the corners of the city like a fog that could not be escaped. And he remembered the day an intelligence officer from Abwehr returned from a covert mission to the United States, a man who had gone in with arrogance and came back with eyes hollowed by something close to awe. And Mertens could still hear his voice, quiet and almost trembling, recounting what he had seen. Trains longer than city blocks carrying nothing but engines, aircraft frames stacked like skeletons stretching toward the sky, Rivers choked with cargo ships waiting to be loaded and workers. So many workers, moving with a rhythm that seemed almost choreographed. Men and women tapping rivets, rolling steel, welding beams, assembling engines with a speed and precision that defied imagination. And he had whispered a line that haunted Mertens to this day. They do not build like a nation at war. They build like a nation preparing to replace the world. And those words had slipped into the back of Mertens' mind like a splinter, painful because they were true. And in that truth he saw the quiet collapse of everything he had believed about Germany's industrial superiority, a pride that had shaped his entire career, his studies, his service, and now lay in shards at his feet. And as he opened the door to his dimly lit office, where stacks of reports leaned against the walls like silent accusations, he felt the exhaustion inside him settle deeper, a weariness not the body but the soul, because every new document, every intercepted photograph, every whispered testimony from spies and diplomats reinforced the same inescapable reality. America did not simply have more factories. It had factories operating on a different scale, a scale so massive that comparing them to German plants felt almost childish. And he thought of the Ford River, Rouge Complex, a place so vast that raw iron or entered one end and finished vehicles rolled out the other, as if an entire industrial ecosystem had been compressed into a single building. And he thought of the shipyards on the West Coast, where Liberty ships were assembled so quickly that journalists joked a man could watch one being built in real time. And the Germans had laughed at those reports once, dismissing them as impossible, as American exaggeration, until the intelligence. Photographs arrived and the laughter died in their throats, replaced by a cold realization that America could construct a fleet faster than the Kriegsmarine could sink it. And in the quiet of his office, Mertens closed his eyes and imagined his son, Hans, shivering somewhere on the Eastern Front, fighting a different storm, one made of snow, steel, and endless Soviet forces. And he wondered if Hans knew, if any of the young men fighting knew, that behind the American soldiers firing across the hedgerows and frozen forests stood a production engine so immense that it could replace every casualty, every loss, every destroyed tank or aircraft without hesitation. And the thought twisted inside him like a blade, because he knew those boys were dying in battles whose outcomes had been decided in factories thousands of kilometers away, places they would never see, never understand, and yet whose shadows stretched over their fates like the hands of giants. And as he sat at his desk, pen trembling slightly between his fingers, he began drafting the report that would soon reach the high command, outlining in meticulous detail the full scale of American industrial capacity. And with each sentence he felt as though he was carving an obituary, not for the Reich, not for the armies, but for the illusion that Germany had ever stood on equal footing with a nation that built with the strength of an entire continent. And he wrote of the 300,000 aircraft produced, the tens of thousands of tanks, the millions of rifles, the billions of rounds of ammunition, and the rivers of fuel refined every day, while Germany scraped together dwindling supplies, ration metal, and drafted boys who barely fit their uniforms. And when he finished, he stared at the final words for a long moment, his breath shallow, a quiet ache tugging the back of his throat, because those words were not strategy, not prediction. They were confession, the silent admission that they had underestimated their enemy from the start, believing that willpower, discipline, and engineering alone could overcome sheer industrial magnitude. And as he folded the report and sealed it, he whispered something he had never allowed himself to say aloud. We never had a chance. And in that whisper there was no bitterness, no accusation, only a quiet, mournful acceptance, as though he were speaking not as a German officer, but as a man who had finally seen the full shape of the war for what it truly was. A contest, not of ideology or courage, but creation, scale, and the relentless pulse of factories that beat with the strength of an empire made not by conquest, but by production. And as he blew out the flickering candle on his desk, plunging the room into darkness, the distant thunder of American bombers rumbled overhead, and he felt the cold truth settle into his bones like winter. The war was no longer something they could win. It was something they were surviving, moment by moment, until the inevitable end arrived like a shadow stretching across the ruins of a city that had once believed it could reshape the world. Mertens lay awake on the narrow cot in his quarters, staring at the cracked ceiling as if the fissures above him were maps of the war's unraveling, each fracture front collapsing, each shadow a grim reminder that time was running out. and as the distant hum of generators pulsed through the bunker walls like a tired heartbeat, he closed his eyes and tried to remember the Germany he had once believed in, the one of order, precision, and quiet confidence. But all he could see were the photographs, the maps, the graphs etched into his mind with cruel clarity, visions of American factories that dwarf entire districts of Berlin, machines towering over workers like metallic titans, cranes lifting engines the size of small cottages, and rows of workers moving with mechanical grace, their hands polished by repetition, their work fueled not by ideology, but by a collective momentum, a national rhythm that had become unstoppable. And he thought back to a conversation he had overheard months earlier among senior officers, men decorated with medals that had long since lost their meaning, sitting in a dim room with cigarette smoke coiling toward the ceiling like ghosts rising from the ashes of their former certainty. And one officer, an old general with a gravelly voice, had whispered, "We underestimated their imagination. We thought they were soft, but we never understood how they think." And Mertens had felt those words burrow into him like cold water seeping beneath armor, because imagination was not something you could bomb, nor blockade, nor outmaneuver. And as he sat on the cot, unable to rest, he walked down the corridor, boots tapping softly against the concrete floor, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of gasoline, until he reached the communications room where a young operator, barely old enough to shave, sat hunched over a radio set with headphones pressed tight against his ears, eyes glazed with exhaustion. And when he saw Mertens, he straightened, saluting weakly as static whispered through the wires like distant spirits trying to speak. And Mertens placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, a gentle gesture meant to reassure, though he did not know exactly what reassurance meant anymore, and he asked, "Any new transmissions?" And the boy nodded, handing him a slip of paper with trembling fingers, and on that thin sheet were reports from multiple fronts. More Allied vehicles sighted, more aircraft, more artillery, more signs that America's industrial river was not slowing but accelerating, and though the reports were brief, each line felt like another nail sealing the fate of Reich, and Mertens folded the paper quietly, thanking the boy with a weary nod before stepping back into the cold corridor, where the reality of the war pressed against him with suffocating clarity. And he thought of the men on the front lines, tired, starving, wounded, standing against an enemy who arrived not in waves, but in storms of tanks so numerous that their engines cast dust clouds across entire horizons, storms of aircraft that darkened the skies with wings stamped from American steel, storms of ammunition that fell like rain from ships that crossed the Atlantic in endless convoys guarded by destroyers churned out of shipyards faster than U-boats could hunt them. And he imagined the fear in a German infantryman's eyes as he watched Sherman after Sherman roll across the fields, each one a product of a factory thousands of miles away that had produced so many tanks that losing one felt insignificant to the Americans. And he imagined the frustration of Luftwaffe pilots, brave and skilled, who soared into the sky only to find themselves outnumbered 10-1, facing swarms of Thunderbolts and Mustangs whose pilots were young, confident, and backed by an industrial base that could replace their losses before the smoke of battle even cleared. And he realized then that the soldiers of the Reich were not being defeated by strategy. They were being drowned by a tide of steel and fire that no army on earth could stop once it began. And as he walked toward the exit of the bunker, the faint dawn light seeping through the cracks like a promise and a warning, he stepped into the ruins of Berlin, where smoke curled into morning sky and shattered windows reflected the pale sun like shards of broken hope, and he heard footsteps behind him, slow, steady, and turned to see General Kurt Reimann, an old friend whose uniform hung loosely from his thin frame, eyes sunken but still carrying a quiet defiance. And Reimann approached with a tired smile, saying, "You're up early." And Mertens shook his head with a hollow laugh, replying, "I don't sleep much anymore." And together they walked to the rubble-strewn street, passing collapsed buildings and burnt-out vehicles, the air filled with the low murmur of survivors searching for water, food, anything to hold on to. And Reimann said softly, "I read your report." And Mertens felt his chest tighten, waiting for criticism, doubt, or denial, but none came. And instead Reimann's voice dropped to a whisper, "It's worse than we feared." And those words sailed between them like a weight neither man could bear alone. And Reimann continued, "All this time, we believed war was decided by bravery, discipline, and will, but we were wrong. Reinhard, war is decided by the ability to build what is lost, and they can build faster than we can dream." And for a long moment they walked in silence, their boots crunching over broken glass. the distant rumble of artillery a dull echo in the background, until Merton said quietly, "Then why do we keep going?" And Ryman stopped, looking out at the ruins of the city they had once sworn to protect. And he answered in a voice heavy with sorrow, "Because someone must stand between the collapse and the people who still breathe, even if standing changes nothing." And those words carved themselves into Merton's heart, a painful truth he had avoided, because the war was no longer about victory. It was about holding on long enough to protect the innocent from the final wave of destruction. And as the sun climbed slowly over the broken rooftops, its light revealing the city's wounds in cruel detail, Mertens felt the weight of duty shift inside him, no longer tied to the Reich, nor to its failing ambitions, but to the people who live beneath the shadows of crumbling buildings, people who deserve more than the delusions of leaders who refuse to see the truth. And in that moment, he knew that the coming months would not be about strategy or loyalty, but about survival. Survival of those who could no longer fight. Survival of children who had never asked for war. Survival of the last fragile pieces of humanity, left in a city drowning in the echoes of its own downfall. And as he inhaled the sharp morning air, he whispered to himself, not in defeat, but in clarity, "The factories decided this war, not us." And the wind carried his words over the rubble, like a fading prayer swallowed by the ruins of a world losing its final hold on hope. Mertens felt the day stretch before him like a long exhale from a dying world as he and Ryman walked deeper into the ruins of Berlin, the city trembling under the distant tremor of artillery that grew closer with each passing hour. And as they moved past a collapsed schoolhouse, where chalk dust still clung to broken desks like the last remnants of lessons no one would finish, they heard soft footsteps and turned to see a small group of civilians emerging from the shadows, children clutching tin cups, an elderly woman wrapped in a threadbare shawl, and a young mother carrying a quiet baby whose wide eyes reflected the abandoned streets like mirrors of a future stolen before it could begin. And Mertens felt his breath hitch as the children stopped in front of him, looking up with expressions that were neither hopeful nor afraid, only tired. And the oldest among them, a boy no more than 12, asked in a voice so soft it barely rose above the wind, "Is it true? Are the Americans coming?" And the question pierced Mertens deeper than any accusation, because he heard in it not fear of the enemy, but a strange, quiet longing, a longing for the gunfire to stop, for the hunger to end, for the nightmares to loosen their grip on every corner of their lives. And Mertens knelt down, lowering himself until he was eye level with the boy, and he saw the bruises on his arms, the way his hands trembled from cold and exhaustion, and he answered gently, "Yes, they are coming." And the boy nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd suspected but needed to hear aloud. And without another word, he turned back toward the small group, whispering, "Soon." And for the first time in weeks, Merton saw a flicker of something fragile in the boy's eyes. Not joy, not relief, but the faintest shimmer of release, like someone realizing that suffering was finally reaching its limit. And as the group wandered away into the ruins, Ryman exhaled slowly, his voice thick, when he said, "They shouldn't have to wait for an enemy to feel safe." And Mertens closed his eyes, feeling a deep ache inside him, because he knew this war had long ago stopped being about nations, borders, or ideology. It had become a storm consuming everything in its path, leaving civilians to cling to scraps of humanity, while soldiers, on all sides, carried the unbearable weight of choices that were never truly theirs. And together the two men continued walking until they reached a half-destroyed government building where a meeting of senior officers was already underway. The air inside thick with smoke and desperation, maps spread across the table like dying animals covered in red ink that bled across every border, every river, every town. And the officers, once proud, once certain, now spoke in fractured sentences, their voices trembling with the exhaustion of men who knew they were trying to hold back an avalanche with their bare hands. And when Mertens placed his report on the table, the room fell silent, every eye turning toward him with a mixture of dread and reluctant hope, because in these final months hope and fear had become indistinguishable, blurred by the constant strain of survival. And Mertens began to speak, his voice calm but heavy, describing the relentless rise of American production, the endless convoys crossing the Atlantic, the factories that never slowed, never dimmed, never slept. And as he spoke, he felt the room tighten, shoulders sagging, jaws clenching, because each word was not just information but confession. The war they had devoted their lives to was no longer something that could be won. And yet even now they were being asked to fight as if victory were still possible, to send boys to die for a cause already decided far from the battlefield, in the roaring furnaces and rattling assembly lines of a distant continent. And when he finished, silence filled the room like a cold fog, thick and suffocating, until an aging general, one whose decorations clinked gently as he leaned forward, asked in a voice that shook with something far older than fear, "What do you suggest, Oberst Mertens?" And Mertens looked around the room, at the faces carved by fatigue and disillusionment, and he realized that this was not a moment for strategy but for truth, raw and unembellished. And so he said softly, "We must think beyond pride, beyond orders, beyond the illusions we once believed in. We must think of the people, what remains." And the general stared at him, eyes wet with unspoken grief, before whispering, "Then we are only prolonging suffering." And the truth of those words settled over the room like dust from a collapsing wall, undeniable and suffocating, and yet no one spoke further because the decision was no longer in their hands. The war had outgrown them, consumed them, and now only fate, or perhaps mercy, would decide how it ended. And as Merton stepped back into the gray afternoon light, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet, painful acceptance that the role he had played in this war, the beliefs he had clung to, had dissolved into a single, haunting understanding. Wars are not lost when armies fall. They are lost when nations run out of time, and Germany's time had been stolen not by bombs or bullets, but by the unstoppable roar of American industry, by the factories that rose like mountains of steel and smoke, reshaping the war with every engine they built, every shell they forged, every rivet hammered into place by hands far from the front lines. And as the first flakes of winter snow drifted down, settling softly on the ruins, Mertens looked toward the west, where the distant horizon glowed faintly with the reflection of fires, and he felt something he had not felt in many months. Not hope, not peace, but fragile, mournful clarity. The understanding that surrender was not the end of honor, but the preservation of what little humanity remained, the final act of mercy in a world consumed by fire. And in that realization, he whispered to the cold wind, as if speaking to his son, to the city, to all those who had suffered, "May what comes next be kinder than what brought us here." And his voice drifted into the snow-filled air, disappeared like a final breath carried toward a future he would likely never see, but one he prayed, silently and desperately, would rise from the ashes with gentler hands than the ones that had torn the world apart. The snow thickened as twilight bled slowly into the broken avenues of Berlin, settling on twisted tram lines and shattered rooftops like a quiet shroud draped over a dying world. And Mertens walked alone to the soft, ghostly whiteness, listening to the muffled crunch of his boots as if time itself had begun to move more slowly. Each step an echo of a life he once recognized but no longer belonged to. And ahead of him the city stretched like a wounded giant, its breath shallow, its pulse weak, its streets filled with shadows of people moving silently between ruins, each face etched with the same question that no one dared to voice aloud. When will this end? And as Mertens turned a corner, he saw a group of soldiers, boys really, waiting beside a burned-out transport truck, their cheeks hollow, eyes too old for their young bodies, rifles slung loosely over shoulders that could no longer carry the moral weight of the war. And one of them, a private with snow gathering on his eyelashes, looked up at Mertens with a small, desperate hope and asked, "Herr Oberst, is it true they're coming with tanks that never stop? That they have more planes than we have bullets?" And Mertens felt the question fall between them like a stone into freezing water, creating ripples of fear he could not calm. And he placed a hand on the private's shoulder, feeling the trembling beneath the coarse wool of the uniform. And he did not answer with numbers or strategy or false promises, but with the only truth he had left. "They are coming and you must stay alive. That is all that matters now." And the private nodded, swallowing hard, as if he understood that survival, not victory, not glory, was the last order worth obeying. And as Mertens walked on, leaving the young soldiers behind, he felt an ache within him deepen, a sense of responsibility not to a regime or to orders, but to these fragile lives scattered across the ruin like embers struggling to stay alight. And he thought of Hans again, somewhere to the east, and wondered if a man could feel his own child slipping from his grasp even across hundreds of kilometers of frozen earth. And he whispered a silent prayer to whatever God still listened. Let him live. Let him survive this. Night approached with a violet hush, the kind that settles over a battlefield after the guns have paused but before they roar again, and the city flickered with distant fires. orange glows rising behind skeletal buildings like the slow pulsing of a wounded heart. And Mertens found himself standing before the ruins of a once grand manufacturing hall. Its roof collapsed, windows shattered, machines buried under rubble. And as he stepped inside, brushing snow from the collar of his coat, he imagined what this place had been years earlier. The clang of hammers, the hum of lathes, the proud rhythm of German industry that had once convinced the nation it could shape its destiny through precision, order, and relentless will. But now the silence inside the hall felt like a verdict, a hollow echo that whispered through the beams. We were outbuilt before the first shot was fired, and Mertens walked through the rubble, trailing his fingers along a twisted steel girder, feeling the cold metal beneath his gloves like the bone of a fallen giant. And he closed his eyes, picturing the American factories again, the endless lines of workers, the deafening roar of production, the ships rolling off dry docks with the inevitability of tides. And for the first time, he felt not fear or bitterness, but a quiet, painful admiration, the recognition that the Americans had turned machinery into a form of resolve, that their factories were not monuments to war, but engines of a collective belief that freedom, threatened or challenged, must be defended by a force too overwhelming to deny. And he realized that this belief, more than the steel itself, had powered the Allied advance through Europe like an unstoppable current beneath the surface of history. As he stepped back outside, the snow falling heavier now, he saw Ryman waiting for him across the courtyard, his breath forming white clouds as he said, "There are rumors the Americans are approaching the outskirts." And Mertens nodded slowly, the truth settling into him like the weight of the cold air around them. And Ryman continued, his voice trembling with something that was almost relief. "The men are tired. The civilians have nothing left. Maybe this is mercy." And Mertens stared out, toward the horizon, where faint flashes of artillery lit the sky in distant bursts, like dying stars. And he felt a strange calm spreading through him, an understanding that what was coming was not annihilation, but a kind release, the end of a nightmare that had stretched too long, taken too much, broken too many. And he whispered more to himself and to Ryman, when the factories began to glow, the war was already decided. And Ryman placed a hand on his arm, saying softly, "Then all we can do now is protect who we can." And together they walked through the falling snow, their footsteps fading behind them as if the city were already erasing the last traces of a war that had consumed its soul. And in that quiet, frozen night, as the final hours of the Reich ticked away beneath a sky heavy with snow and fate, Oberst Reinhard Mertens found himself standing not as a soldier of a collapsing army, but as a witness. One man among millions who had seen the truth behind the smoke and the steel, who understood that wars are not merely fought on battlefields, but in the choices nations make long before the first gunshot, in the dreams they build, the factories they raise, the futures they imagine. And he realized that America's power had never been just its machines, but the faith of its people working day and night in those factories, the belief that they could build a world safer than the one they inherited. And it struck him with a painful, almost beautiful clarity that this collective hope, was what Germany had truly lost the moment it chose conquest over humanity. And as the snow fell thicker, coating the ruins of Berlin in a soft white blanket that seemed to promise rest after endless suffering, Mertens closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the war finally loosening its grip on his chest. And in that fragile silence, he understood what history would remember. Not the speeches, not the strategies, not the burning cities, but the quiet, fragile truth that the cost of war is not counted in victories or defeats, but in the lives changed forever by the choices of a few and the mercy of many, and the factories whose relentless roar shaped the fate of nations. And with that realization settling into him like the first warmth of a distant dawn, he whispered into the snow-filled air, "May we never forget what it cost to learn this." And the wind carried his words softly across the ruins, as if cradling them toward a future built, he hoped, with gentler hands, kinder hearts, and a humanity finally awakened by the ashes of its darkest hour. The quiet settled over Berlin like a fragile veil, the snow still falling in slow, deliberate flakes that muted the sound of broken streets and collapsed buildings, and Mertens walked among them with a strange sense of weight lifted, though the city itself seemed to groan beneath the scars of war, whispering tales of despair and courage alike. And as he passed the skeletal remains of factories once churning with German ambition, he could almost hear the ghosts of machines, their rhythmic pounding replaced by silence, a silence that spoke louder than any cannon, telling him that the true battlefield had been across the ocean, where American factories never slept and never paused, their lights glowing even to the darkest nights, forging the tools of victory that felt both inevitable and cruel. And in that silence, he understood fully what surrender would mean. Not shame, not defeat, but the preservation of life. A final acknowledgement that some wars cannot be fought to the bitter end without consuming everything in their path. And he thought of the young soldiers he had passed that morning, huddled around a fire, eyes wide and haunted. And he realized that their courage was not enough to overcome the tide of steel and smoke that had already swept across the continents. And in that realization, Mertens felt a deep, sorrowful compassion, a moral weight heavier than any report or calculation, because the war was no longer about strategy, but about the fragile remnants of humanity left in its wake. And as he turned toward the outskirts of the city, he saw faint lights in the distance, the glimmer of approaching Allied forces, and he knew the moment of reckoning was at hand, not with the roar of battle alone, but with a quiet, devastating acknowledgement that the world had shifted irreversibly, that the factories across the sea had written history before a single German soldier had been captured, and that the surrender, when it came, would carry with it not just the end of a nation's ambitions, but the painful birth of understanding that the power to sustain, to rebuild relentlessly, is often more decisive than the courage to destroy. And Mertens thought his son, Hans, and of every boy sent to the front lines, and he felt a surge of grief mixed with the faintest glimmer of hope, because even in defeat, lives could be spared, suffering could be halted, and perhaps, just perhaps, humanity could endure the shadows of its own making. And as the snow continued to fall, covering the ruins in a quiet, reflective blanket, he whispered one final acknowledgement to the city, to the soldiers, to the civilians, to the future itself, that the war had been won not by bombs or bullets alone, but by the relentless heartbeat of creation, by the factories that never stopped, by the hands and minds of people determined to forge life from steel. And in that truth lay the haunting, eternal lesson that the cost of war is measured, not merely in destruction, but in the fragile, human stories that endure long after the guns fall silent. And as Mertens walked toward the approaching lights, toward the soldiers who would end the nightmare with mercy rather than fury, he understood, with painful clarity and a heart both heavy and enlightened, that surrender can be an act of courage, that acknowledgement of reality can be a form of love, and that even in the darkest hour, humanity can find its final, haunting dignity. Weary faces alike, Oberst Reinhard Mertens finally understood the quiet, haunting truth of the war. That victory was never measured by courage alone, nor by strategy or pride, but by the relentless power to create, to sustain, and to rebuild, a power the Americans had wielded with terrifying consistency. And in that realization, he felt a deep, aching sorrow for the boys sent to fight, the civilians who had suffered, and the nation that had believed it could defy an enemy whose strength was not in men or guns, but in the endless pulse of industry and determination. And yet, within that sorrow, there was clarity, a fragile, painful light. Surrender was not shame nor defeat, but the final act of mercy, a choice to preserve life when all else had been lost. And as Mertens walked to the quiet city, the wind carrying whispers of snow and memory, he understood that history would remember the guns and the tanks, the battles and the orders, but the true cause of war, the lives changed, forever, the humanity tested, the mercy granted, would linger long after the smoke cleared, a solemn reminder that even in the darkest hour, the human heart endures, capable of recognizing truth, offering forgiveness, and holding fast to the fragile dignity that survives even when nations fall. And with that knowledge pressing softly against his chest, he whispered into the winter air, not for glory or absolution, but for remembrance and for hope. May we never forget what it costs to learn this, and may we strive to build a world kinder than the one we leave behind.